Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Today we're talking about the democratic crisis unfolding in Newfoundland and Labrador, where the province is in the midst of an election stuck in limbo. The Newfoundland election was called early, was partially suspended, and then rescheduled and moved to mail-in ballots only. This is having a dramatic impact on the democratic process, and there are questions over the legality of the sudden changes. By law, an election in Newfoundland needs to take place in 2021, but it could have been called later in the year, as late as August. Instead, it was called by Newfoundland Premier Andrew Furey on January 15th to take place on February 13th. But just 2 days before Election Day, the Chief Electoral Officer, Bruce Chalk, made a shocking announcement. Following a surge of COVID cases, Mr. Chalk announced that he did not have enough election staff to actually run in-person voting in 18 of the province's 40 electoral districts, nearly half the province. Chalk said that the election needs to be delayed, but that he didn't have clear authority to delay the election himself. So he called on Newfoundland Chief Medical Officer Janice Fitzgerald to use her powers to delay the election. But Fitzgerald said she didn't have authority either. So later the same day, only hours after saying he lacks authority to do so, Newfoundland Chief Electoral Officer Bruce Chalk delayed the election by 2 weeks for half the province, just 2 days before it was set to take place. And the story doesn't end there. The very next day, it was discovered that many of Newfoundland's surging cases included the COVID variant. So Mr. Chalk canceled all in-person voting for the entire province of Newfoundland and moved everything to mail-in ballots with a new March 5th deadline. Now, Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I wanted to ask you, what is the on-the-ground impact that this change, all of these changes, is having on candidates?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, most of the New Democratic Party's candidates are working people. They're pharmacy assistants, they're artists, they're municipal councillors, they're welders, right? So, they're not career politicians that can just afford to spend an extra month, 5 weeks waiting for the election that never ends to come to an end. So it's been difficult. Many of our candidates have had to go back to work. They had a job that they got leave from for 4 weeks, the election period. And even though the election didn't end at the end of those 4 weeks, they had to go back to their job. They had, people they had to help. They had employers who were counting on them to provide services. So it's been difficult for them. And a lot of them have found themselves playing two roles during this, pre-post election period, this period in the wilderness, I guess. It's been tough on them.
And what have you guys been hearing from voters who I'm sure are also really confused about this whole process?
Yeah, I think, the confusion comes from the complete lack of legislative provision and foresight that would have enabled, a chief electoral officer to clearly communicate what their roles and responsibilities would be. Our job as political parties at this point is to make sure that the greatest number of people vote, that everybody who wants to cast a ballot gets a chance to do so. The political parties have expressed that they feel that it's their role to do that. The chief electoral officer actually has explicitly declared that things like voter turnout are not his concern, which was alarming to us to hear. So, we as political parties have turned our attention to making sure that not just our supporters, but everybody who needs to understand how the voting process works gets access to it.
And how much time is there for people to actually get these mail-in ballots?
Yeah, that's been a moving target, right? It just seems like whenever there's a delay, there's an extension. And these extensions are necessary. Absolutely. We aren't complaining that extensions have been made. I think we're complaining that the extension hasn't been made at all, instead of a sufficient amount of time being allotted for people to cast their ballots in the first place. We even ran into issues with wrong phone numbers for requests for mail-in ballots being given out. And it turns out that the website to request mail-in ballots crashed during the last 3 hours or so of the request period. So there's a whole bunch of people who went to request a ballot during the last 3 or 4 hours of the eligible period and didn't get one.
Couldn't get one.
Response
Crazy.
Kyle,
let's jump back into that after these commercial messages. Welcome back to Canadian Justice. We're here with Kyle Rees from the Newfoundland NDP party talking about the chaos unfolding during the Newfoundland election. Now, Kyle, it seems pretty clear that the election wasn't going to be able to happen with not enough staff to run the election. So what do you think should have happened in this situation?
I mean, prevention was the key here. It was totally irresponsible for the premier of this province to call an election in the middle of a pandemic.
Because he didn't have to call it right now, right? He could have waited.
He didn't have to, absolutely not. It was a strategically advantageous time for the Liberal premier to call this election. There's a very damning economic report that's about to come out any day now, and there was a real push for this premier to sort of call the election to firm up his majority before that report comes out and before it forces him to make tough policy decisions. So it was irresponsible to call it now, and it was irresponsible to call it without making sufficient legislative provision to ensure the election could be carried out safely and legally.
So do you think that there should have been a legislative change before this happened? Because I think there's a lot of debate about whether or not there was authority to delay the election this way. Do you think they could have foreseen that this was going to be a problem?
Yeah, I don't think there should have been a legislative change. I think there should have been many legislative changes to Newfoundland and Labrador's Elections Act, just for greater participation and better democratic systems, but also to allow for the chief electoral officer, for instance, to extend the voting period once the writ has been dropped. I mean, that would just be a very simple amendment that would very clearly give that chief electoral officer the power to do what he ultimately needed to do. But as a result of the failure to plan, the failure to make provision, it's throwing the election into some degree of legal doubt.
I mean, certainly they can't make those changes now with Parliament dissolved. But I mean, do you think that this process, how it's unfolded, is damaging to democracy in Newfoundland?
I think it is, just from the very fact that, by all indications, even if everybody who received a mail-in ballot actually returns their mail-in ballot, we're aiming for a voter participation rate of about 51% in this election. And I don't think all those ballots are coming in, so I think we're going to be under 50%. That's a record low. That's very concerning, given that the premier of this province is going to have to make some difficult decisions.
It sounds incredibly low, especially given the amount of reporting. I'm sure there's a lot of people who want to vote and aren't going to be able to. But I want to ask you, do you think that this is going to undermine the public's faith in the outcome of the election when this is all said and done?
Yeah, it's concerning. I think the public is going to see this for what it is. It was a power grab by the Liberal government. And, I think any sensible person evaluating how this election was called and how it was conducted is going to see that that's what it was. And it's unfortunate because we wanted to run an election that revolved around the issues, that revolved around, a $15 minimum wage, that revolved around Newfoundland's fiscal crisis, that revolved around rights for workers. That's the kind of thing that the NDP's always been interested in. And instead, this became an election about an election. It was a very sort of meta election. That was really unfortunate.
A meta election. I've never heard that term, but I love it. I think that that's a great description of what seems to be happening in Newfoundland. And I wonder if you have any idea about what type of example this might set for the rest of Canada. What lessons do you think other provinces or even the federal government could learn from what's happened to your province?
Yeah, we hate to be like the bad example that the rest of the country has to learn from, but apparently we're destined to be that, at least as far as their politics goes. Here's the lesson for the rest of the country and all the other provinces. Either don't hold an election in the middle of the pandemic, or if you're going to do it, think about what a pandemic means in terms of how you need to hold an election differently. If you're the lieutenant government of any particular province and the premier comes to you and asks to dissolve their House of Assembly, their Parliament, their House of Representatives in order to hold an election, ask the person who's asking you to dissolve their government whether they've planned for a pandemic. I think such very simple questions, which to me speak to some degree of negligence in not answering them, would go a long way in terms of allowing people to not get themselves in the situation this province is.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of concern for candidates of all parties. I mean, how you get out the vote, how you manage your budget, how you manage your time. I mean, I would be devastated as a voter or as a candidate in this situation. So thank you so much, Kyle, for coming on today to talk about the perspective of the people on the ground who are dealing with the fallout from some of these choices that your political leaders have made. It was a great conversation, so thanks for participating.
Take care.
Thank you. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the chaotic Newfoundland election that's been postponed and then had in-person voting cancelled. Joined by me now to discuss the legal and political implications are two scholars. Professor Michael Powell teaches constitutional and election law at the University of Ottawa, and Wayne McKay teaches constitutional law at Dalhousie. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Professor Powell, let's start with you. There's been some confusion about whether or not Newfoundland election officer, chief election officer, actually had authority to delay the election. In fact, he seemed confused about it himself. So can I ask you, does he have that authority?
Well, thanks for having me. I guess the question depends whether we agree with what the chief electoral officer said initially or what he's saying now. To be fair to the chief electoral officer, he's in a very tough position. The statute, you have to be guided by the statute as a chief electoral officer. All the chief electoral officers across the country stick to it very closely, their home statute. This statute did not have clear provisions as to what should happen in an emergency. So Section 5 of the Newfoundland Elections Act gives the CEO broad superintendent's direction and control over elections. That's very common language. Then Section 10 says there's some discretionary power, including to adapt any provision of the act. So I think the CEO could say, I can adapt any provision of the act. That includes delaying the election. That includes switching to an all postal ballot, special ballots in the Newfoundland terminology election. The problem is it's never been interpreted that way. That language is common in other statutes. It's sometimes used for sometimes emergencies in one riding due to a flood or something like that, but never to transform the basic method of voting from in-person voting to voting by mail. So the CEO is in a very tough position. I think the letter to the chief medical officer was unwise. I think Section 10 can be stretched to include the authority to manage the election in the way that he has, but it certainly is unprecedented, and there isn't some clear precedent that you can point to that would have established that authority in advance.
So, Professor McKay, what's your interpretation? Do you think that the chief electoral officer had this authority?
Well, I would agree with just about everything that Professor Powell said on that. The only thing that I would perhaps add to that is you're the expert on elections, Professor Powell, but I think I saw that they're to interpret those kind of statutes as much as possible as promoting enfranchisement. So make it as accessible as possible. But that could be interpreted either way. But given what's happening here, it may not be particularly good that way in making it accessible. The only other thing that I would add, I think Section 10(5), as you say, is kind of the boiler point. You have to do whatever you have to do to make the election happen. But 10 does give some kind of archaic language that would suggest you could adapt it in an emergency or unforeseen circumstances, which this is. So I think that probably gives enough to do something. And part of the reason they'd have to interpret it that way is what else could you do? I mean, you really couldn't proceed with the election in the midst of the virus. And so surely the act has to have something that allows this to happen, whether it's going in the right way. And then on the second point, I think it's Section 86 allows for these special ballots. That was certainly never intended to be the way for the whole election. But it perhaps, again, there may be no other choice than to have it happen in a safe way except by doing that.
So, Professor Powell, what do you think the alternative was? I mean, it seems obvious the election couldn't logistically proceed. What do you think should have happened? And I know there's been some debate over whether the Lieutenant General should have declined making an election available. What's your response to that?
Once the election was called and the writs were drawn up, but we had the Elections Act, the Newfoundland and Labradorians had the Elections Act that they had, there were only really bad scenarios. What should have happened was amending the act in advance to make the emergency power. It might be there in Section 10, but it'd be better if it was clear. And also, had it been amended to take into account the fact that you might have to move to an all mail-in ballot, special ballot, postal ballot election. That was always the backup plan if there was an outbreak. That was the same in New Brunswick, same in Saskatchewan, same in BC that also had elections. I think those elections went relatively well. So I think maybe people thought you wouldn't have to go to mail-in ballots, but the act should have been amended. Short of that, the only other thing legally, and now we're getting into quite controversial issues, is the writs could have been withdrawn. And who can do that? That can only be the Lieutenant Governor acting on the advice.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about the Newfoundland election. Now, Professor MacKay, I want to ask you, what happens after this election is completed? Will there be grounds to challenge the result? And if there is a challenge, what happens then? Can the entire election be thrown out, or is it only in the polls where it's challenged? Do they need to do this whole thing all over again?
Lots of complicated questions, but let me start with the first one. I mean, I think the most likely challenge, apart from the whole jurisdiction and statute point we just talked about, is a charter challenge based on Section 3 guarantees under the Charter to democratic rights, and that includes the right to vote. And that has been interpreted in a number of cases as saying that means a meaningful right to vote. And as one part of meaningful, that it has to be a fairly equal opportunity or a relatively equal opportunity for everyone to have access. And there's so many indications that that isn't really necessarily happening in this case. So I think, and people have talked about that. I think various people have already suggested that there might be that kind of challenge. And on your other points, if it's unconstitutional, almost any of the remedies you suggested might be a possibility, including having another election.
Professor Powell, what's your take? What do you think the likelihood is of a challenge of the result once this is all said and done?
There aren't actually that many cases challenging election results in Canada. Normally, there have been a few. There was the Opitz case at the Supreme Court. There was the robocalls case. In Newfoundland, there was one based on the special ballot procedures, the Mitchell case from 2011 election. So I think the likelihood is high. To me, Professor MacKay absolutely right. Section 3 challenge, probably around the fact that you had to apply to get a special ballot, and that some people's some people voted early and those votes still count. Then some people were forced to apply for a ballot later if you plan to vote in person and then were not able to. So there are some inequalities within the group of people otherwise eligible to vote that I think will be subject to litigation, but only if the results are close. That's usually the way it works. If you think that, if someone wins by 10,000 votes, it's unlikely to be challenged because you probably won't find enough ballots to be able to change the result. But if we're in a Section 3 world, then it might be different. It may simply be the election is tainted, as Professor MacKay suggested. Yeah,
and it certainly makes me concerned about it undermining public confidence in the result. But I want to ask you, Professor Powell, what precedent does this set for the rest of the country? We know there's, the looming prospect of a federal election with any minority government constantly. So is there any concern about this situation playing out federally?
Any sensible person, I think, would look at the Newfoundland and Labrador election and say, we need to try to mitigate any risk of a similar scenario. This pandemic's gone on long enough. The idea that we can delay all elections as long as possible stops being feasible. So I'm sympathetic to legislatures or parliament or government if it's time to have an election, but we need to be prepared to have a mail-in voter in much higher numbers. You need to try to spread voters out, so make it easier to vote in advance and early. And one thing Newfoundland did well is there's a postmark deadline. So you have to mail in your ballot by a certain date rather than make sure it's received at the election offices by a certain date. It has to be received by a certain date, then your at the mercy of the Postal Service, which quite reasonably be delayed in an emergency.
That does sound like a good idea among many bad ideas that they seem to have had during this election. Thank you both so much for joining me. It's been a fascinating conversation. We've heard today about the drama unfolding in Newfoundland as the provincial election there unravels in the wake of COVID-19 outbreaks. The situation is a challenging one. How exactly is the election supposed to proceed when there aren't enough people to even run the voting process? Was this situation foreseeable? And even if it was, what can be done now? There's some serious and legitimate concerns that whoever loses this election will challenge the result in court. And whatever the result of that challenge, it undermines faith in the election results and the democratic process. There are also concerns about how elections will play out in other provinces. There are municipal elections scheduled across Canada and provincial elections set for the Yukon and Northwest Territories, as well as the perpetual threat of the federal minority government calling an election. How would the Newfoundland precedent impact these other elections? What should be done to prevent the undermining of democracy in the age of COVID? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.